Once a month, my supporters of this show and myself and a special guest have a Zoom meeting. It's not recorded, it's not posted, it's just private. It's between you guys, the guest, and myself. I do this because it means a lot for you guys who support me by showing me that this show means a lot to you. I love talking with you. I look at it as like a benefit for people that support the show, but it's really a benefit for me. I get to know you guys and have an off-the-record discussion with our guest. And, sometimes topics you don't want to necessarily have all the ins and outs discussed online, if you know what I mean. So to be in this group, please go to patreon.com/counterflow and donate $5 or more per month. And it gets you in this club. We do it once a month. It's a great time. It's great people. They're all smarter than me. So that's an upgrade from what you're used to. I can tell you that. The guests are always guests that people want to hear from. A lot of you guys will be familiar with many of the guests. Father Turbo's done it. Father Deacon Ananias has done it. David Patrick Carey's done it. My own priest, Father Ignatius, has done it. Father Moses McPherson's done it. It's a very good time, and I think you guys would enjoy it. If you love this content, please go to patreon.com/counterflow, $5 or more per month. Thank you.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in half, but I call the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Lockhart, Texas once again. And once again, friend of the show, Dr. Jeannie Constantinou is back. She was on it's been too long, right? Previously, we discussed her book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. And what we are discussing today is the oh-so-challenging book of Revelation, the book of the Apocalypse. And the go-to commentary in the Orthodox Church on the book of Revelation is by Andrew of Caesarea. And I remember I was talking to Father John Whiteford a few episodes back, and I think that one was called Bad Theology Leads to Bad Actions, which is a fabulous episode if you've not heard that yet. And we got briefly into the book of Revelation, and he said the go-to commentary on the book of Revelation in the Orthodox Church is a church father known as Andrew of Caesarea. And he said, and the go-to commentary on Andrew of Caesarea's work is none other than our guest, Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. When Father John says something like that, I listen, and so should you. So I wanted to discuss the book of Revelation, and I thought, well, he said she's the expert, and she writes on the expert. So that's what we're going to talk about. Her book is called Guiding to a Blessed End, Andrew of Caesarea and his Apocalypse Commentary in the Ancient Church. She did the entire translation of his commentary and goes through a lot of it in this book, and we're going to go through a lot of that in this interview. Why isn't the book of Revelation read liturgically in our services in the Orthodox Church? Why do some people think, I don't know if you've heard of this Left Behind movies or book series, or we went over the late great Planet Earth with Father John Whiteford. Things like that make people think, well, there's a pre-tribulation rapture coming and the Christians are just going to disappear while everyone else is left behind, which is why that series is called that. For instance, you might have seen the stuff about you're in a plane and the pre-tribulation rapture comes and boom, the pilot's gone because he's saved. And uh-oh, are you still left behind? We get into why some of that kind of floated out into pop culture as though it was fact. And we're just going to get into a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of preconceived notions I had coming at the book of Revelation, some misrepresentations I've heard, misconceptions that just they're really ubiquitous in our pop culture. So we're going to get down to the actual facts and the tradition, and we're going to look at the book of Revelation through the Orthodox Church, the original church, Christ's church, with none other than the great Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. I could just read you her intro of all of her degrees and her studies and whatnot. Let's just let her get to that because I don't want to waste your time any longer. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, welcome back to the show, ma'am. How are you?
Fine. I'm very glad to be back. Thank you for having me back, Buck.
I'm glad to have you here. So we are going to, I always like the people that watch this podcast rather than just listen to it to get a leg up on everyone. But I'm showing the book that we're going to be kind of referencing throughout. It's called, and as are you, Guiding to a Blessed End.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And
while you're doing that, I'll look for the other one.
Saint Andrew of Caesarea and his Apocalypse commentary. Caesarea and his Apocalypse commentary. I was actually interviewing a friend of mine, a priest friend of mine, Father John Whiteford, and we started talking about the book of Revelation. And he said during it, St. Andrew of Caesarea, had kind of the best commentary on it. And Dr. Jeannie Constantinou has the best translation and commentary on that work. And I said, well, that's funny. I've already booked her to come on. So
very good.
I'm glad to have you on here. Well, before we get into this stuff, it's a heavy topic, but we'll kind of keep it basic for a lot of people. I want you to give an intro for who you are. Like I said, I'm glad to have you back on, and then we'll jump into it.
Okay, well, I don't know where to begin. I'm a cradle-born Orthodox. I don't know what people want to learn about. I'm Greek Orthodox. And, grew up in the church, very active in the church in all the different facets of our life. As a sort of, I think, a typical Greek American household, not super religious, but the church was part of our daily life. We didn't really think about it. We loved our church. We had no, interest in finding anything else. But at the same time, I can honestly say, while I knew a lot of things, and I was raised in the faith and wasn't searching for anything else, I really didn't know many things that are quite central to Orthodoxy. And I think that was very typical for the times. And our parents were also very uneducated because their parents were uneducated. They were immigrants and, they were raised in the faith, but they really were in general uneducated, not just about theology, but about anything. My mother was a high school graduate, and that was a big, big deal for her growing up in the Depression to be a girl and to actually finish high school. So that kind of gives you an idea of the fact that they were people of faith and they answered our questions as best they could. But we really didn't have much information about Orthodoxy. And at that time also, there were very few books in English. So one of the things that happens among the Orthodox is they say, why isn't the Orthodox Church more like whatever? Why don't we have more materials? Why don't we have more missionaries? Well, we're doing a lot of catch up. And that's because until very recently, we didn't have much available, not because people didn't love their faith, but they didn't have the means. They didn't have the education. There was a lot of poverty and oppression. My grandparents were all born as subjects of the Ottoman Turkish Empire.
Wow.
They didn't have even a grade school education. So it's a different world. So they could never have imagined my life. So I had those opportunities. And one of the first things that happened to me as a young adult is I met a priest who started talking to me about things I never heard about, because even the priests were not educated, And it's not because the Orthodox Church doesn't value education. It's just they didn't have the opportunities because the infrastructure wasn't there and because of tremendous poverty. So I met a priest who started talking to me about prayer, about the Jesus prayer, which you'd think as any Orthodox Christian would know about, but I had never heard of it, about the fathers of the church. Well, I never heard of them. So I learned about it, became fascinated, and really feel like I'm a convert to my own faith. And as time has passed, we have many more materials, many more books available in English. And of course, we have podcasts like this one and Ancient Faith. And thank God for that. So there's now a wealth of information. What we're lacking is, unfortunately, that grounding in the faith, that the people who grew up in a country like Greece that has been Christian for 2,000 years, there's a kind of enculturation of the faith. There's something that's deeply rooted. There's a mentality, there's a phronima that you develop about the faith that is not easy to explain to people. And there's a sense of rootedness that I think is going to take a while to develop, in this country among the converts. So anyhow, I became very, fascinated by my own faith. I became a religious studies major in college. And then while I was in college, after I did that, I met my husband, and we began, he was ordained as an Orthodox priest. We began serving parishes in California and a couple on the East Coast. And I kept just taking courses and getting degrees wherever we happened to be. And finally ended up with quite a few of them. Too many. The fact that I have too many really shows that there was no thought put into the ultimate outcome, because I didn't need as many degrees as I ended up with, but I was taking them because this is where I was. This is where my husband was serving. So those were the schools nearby, and that's how that ended up. So I have a lot of education. I taught for a number of years. I taught first at our own Greek Orthodox School of Theology, Holy Cross, and subsequently at a couple of other Orthodox institutions, graduate schools of theology. But most of the time, I spent 20 years at a Catholic university here in San Diego called the University of San Diego. I taught in their theology department, biblical studies, early Christianity, medieval church, things like that. And also taught graduate students in the Franciscan School of Theology for 9 years. I have since retired, and now I'm just writing books and going to different places and speaking. So that's a short, kind of longish story. Sorry for that lengthy introduction.
Don't. Well, there's a lot to talk about. And then
right.
I know somewhere in there was this.
Yes. That's a good point. So you see, my husband, when I met him, he was already a PhD student. I never heard of that. My parents, as I said, were children of the Depression. They just were trying to get by. Mm-hmm. And nobody ever said to me, hey, you could be really good at this. You should get a PhD. I heard of PhD. I had no idea what that was.
You thought it was a post hole digger.
I knew it was some kind of degree, but I didn't really know. I mean, this was not part of our world. We also didn't have a family where we knew priests, where we had, because there are some families where there's a lot of priests or relatives. We didn't have anything like that. So all of this came to me quite unexpectedly. So my husband started encouraging me to get a PhD after we moved to Boston, and we served a parish in a suburb of outside of Boston called Somerville, Massachusetts. And we were there for 8 years. And this is the first time I got to take classes from Orthodox professors, and that was at Holy Cross. And I just loved it, because prior to that, I had Catholic professors, Lutheran professors, Episcopalian professors. And for the first time, I got to just imbibe everything and learn the tradition and the fathers. And it was just wonderful. But my husband started saying, you should get your PhD. And I'm like, come on, give me a break. Maybe in 10 years, because we had a little baby. Our son, Christopher, was just a year old. But I didn't realize how much work is involved in a PhD. And once I began to look into it, I realized I had to start. So I started, and I got a couple more degrees along the way. And one of the things you have to decide rather early on is what you want to research, because the idea of a PhD is that you do research and you learn something new. Every other degree is not like that. Other degrees, you read what other people wrote. In the case of a PhD, the idea is that you contribute something to human knowledge, something that nobody else has studied before. Okay. So what I chose is to write on the book of Revelation. Someone suggested that to me. It was one of my professors at Holy Cross, because at that time, this was in the late 90s, they were going to meet at Patmos for the 1900th anniversary of the book of Revelation.
Wow.
And the only, the most important patristic commentary on it had never been translated, into English. So he suggested that I do that, and that was the commentary by Andrew of Caesarea. Not only was it not translated into English, wasn't translated into any modern language, not into German or French or Italian or anything else. So we had translations. We had the original Greek. We had translations into Latin, Armenian, and Slavonic. I think also in Georgian. But you're talking about translations that are hundreds of years old. Even in those languages, they were old. So there was also a Russian bishop named Averky who wrote a kind of a commentary, borrowing a lot from Andrew of Caesarea. But again, it was extremely incomplete. It really wasn't a complete translation. So the other thing about it is, so a PhD is not just a translation. It's also a study, an analysis. You don't get a PhD for doing a translation. But that was the foundation of what I was doing. And after that, we have to figure out something about the man, Andrew of Caesarea, because we really don't know anything about him. And that is, when did he write the commentary? What were the circumstances? Who is his audience? Why did he write it? And then you analyze it as you're going and you write. So the Guiding to a Blessed End is about that commentary, but also about the book of Revelation in the ancient church of the East. One of the questions was, okay, we have some commentaries that are actually older in Latin by people like Victorinus, and also Jerome did a sort of a a commentary that he corrected Victorinus, and also Tychonius, who wrote in Latin, Augustine and Tychonius. Augustine corrected Tychonius, and Jerome corrected Victorinus. Those were a couple hundred years before Andrew of Caesarea wrote in Greek. So one of the questions was, is there any sharing of information? Did Andrew of Caesarea read Latin? And did he read those commentaries? So is that kind of analysis? What approach did he use? And what was his theology? And that sort of a thing. So that's where the book Guiding to a Blessed End came from. And also to understand the book of Revelation in the ancient church of the East, because it was rather hotly debated in the East. It was never disputed in the West, but it kind of fell out of favor and really was not part of the Orthodox canon. So why did this happen? How did it end up in our New Testament when it was rejected by most of the fathers of the church? So those were the kinds of questions I had to answer in my research. So that's all presented there in Guiding to a Blessed End.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I want to get to up front is, for those who are not Orthodox, or maybe if you're inquiring into it or whatever, but talk about why we look to the church fathers and really early writings regarding prophecies, gospels, the book of Revelation, for in this example, for guidance on scripture, and not necessarily like the local preacher down the street.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that question, because you see, that kind of question is the kind of thing I wouldn't even think to have to explain.
Right.
Because it's so natural for us to talk about the fathers of the church, or sometimes people just say church fathers. We don't mean the parish priest. He's not a father of the church. Fathers of the church are the people of holiness, of great education, of knowledge, and who have insights into the Bible. They wrote about the Bible. They wrote about doctrine. They wrote about spiritual things. So they're men of great education and insight and holiness who wrote about these things. And so Andrew of Caesarea is considered a father of the church because he wrote this commentary. But if I have to be completely honest, it's, even though he's called a father, we don't know enough about him. And the reason why we don't have a feast day, for example, I looked, at least if anybody out there knows of the feast day of Andrew of Caesarea, not Andrew of Crete, Andrew of Caesarea, please tell me. I might have to go to Constantinople to find out if he's a saint, but he cannot be a father of the church if he's not a saint in the Orthodox world. Catholics have people that they call church fathers who are just ancient writers. But for us, the person has to be a saint, because for us, when we read the Bible and we're relying on their interpretations, it's because they have insight that comes from their relationship with God. Okay, now, that's very different from Joe Schmo, pastor down the street, like you mentioned. He could say, the Holy Spirit told me thus, such, and the other thing. Well, that's just his opinion. He's not living a holy life. He hasn't done miracles. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
So your life, you haven't been tested the way these men were that we call church fathers. So we rely on them for the following reason. Because the early church understood the meaning of these things, the scriptures. We're talking about the New Testament. Let's just stick with the New Testament.
Right. Sure.
How did they know what Paul meant when he was writing, what Matthew meant, what John meant when he wrote Revelation or when he wrote the gospel? There was an understanding of the meaning of these things that was present in the early church. How do we know that? Because people were reading the scriptures. After they were written, we know that even in the 2nd century, before these books were considered scripture,
yes,
before they were considered scripture, we know that Christians were reading them at their gatherings. And we know this from Justin Martyr. Now, after they read from Gospel of Luke, for example, do you think anybody talked about it, or did they just read it and say nothing? Of course not. They talked about it. Did they say, well, what do you think it means? What do you think it means? What do you think? Of course not. They said, we know that Paul was telling us that Jesus meant this, or Luke was telling us that this meant this. How do they know what was meant? Because the people who wrote these books were alive after they were written, and they explained it.
Yes.
Okay. And the knowledge of that was passed along orally in the church. Okay. So when somebody like Irenaeus, who is one of the earliest fathers, or Justin Martyr talks about something, they're basing their statement on what they know from what they were catechized, what they were taught within the church community. So somebody like, Irenaeus, he knows Justin Martyr. The next century, the 3rd century, you have Hippolytus, who read Irenaeus, who read Justin Martyr, who knew the Apostle John, or who knew Polycarp, who knew the Apostle John. Mm-hmm. Then in the 4th century, you have the fathers of the church who read the fathers of the 3rd century, and the 3rd century fathers had read the fathers of the 2nd century. So they're part of this continuous chain of transmission. And this is why we are confident in what they say, because they're not just getting ideas out of their own heads. That's what people do today, but they didn't do that. They wanted to know, what did Christ mean? And how do we find out what Christ means? Because what did he tell the apostles it meant? The apostles knew what he meant when he said when he said, the kingdom of heaven is taken by violence, a very strange statement. What did he mean by that? So you have modern interpreters have no idea what that means. Okay. But the early church knew what it meant. And that knowledge has been passed along. So the reason is not that we're sort of unable to think for ourselves, and this is why we use the fathers of the church, but because we know that they are reliable guides, because they're not giving us their opinion. We're giving us their insight, and that is based upon a continuous transmission from the time of the apostles. So they have their insight is not necessarily into the actual meaning, but often into the application of that, within the spiritual life.
Yes.
So there's this now, the other reason why we rely so much on the fathers, especially in the early years, is because Greek was their native language. And they were living in the Roman Empire. Even if it was the Christian Roman Empire, nonetheless, they were part of that culture. So just as if today, someone like me was going to write about, let's say, life in the Great Depression or during World War II or something, I have some insight into that because my parents lived through it and they told me about it. So it would be very different for me to write about that with some kind of understanding of this common culture that we have in America, some historical grounding in that. That's going to be very different than somebody writing 500 years later or 1,000 years later. How well are they going to understand it? Who's going to understand it better? Me? A writing that's written today, am I going to understand it better, or am I going to understand something that was written in 1945 better? Will I understand it better, or somebody living 1,000 years from now?
Right.
In a different part of the world.
Yes.
I'm going to understand it better.
Yes.
So that's why we use those fathers, because they truly understand the meaning of these verses. Whereas today, people just open the Bible and they say, well, this is what I think it means, especially with the book of Revelation. They just throw ideas out of their heads.
Yes.
Who cares what you think it means? You're not the inspired person. So there's a lot of hubris. There's a lot of arrogance in people who say they can just read the Bible and they know what it means because the Holy Spirit told them so. Okay. We don't think like that as Orthodox Christians because that's a prescription for spiritual delusion.
Yes.
And if that actually worked, then there wouldn't be 40,000 different Protestant denominations.
Right.
So it doesn't work. So that's a bit, that's why we use the fathers of the church, because they were men who were not only educated, they were holy men. They had also education in the Bible. They were grounded in the early church. And even somebody who was writing, let's say in the 1700s or 1800s or 1900s or the 20th century, they are still reading those same ancient sources. They're drinking from the same well. They're being shaped and formed by the same thought process, by the same information that the earlier fathers had. That's why they're important. So it's not like we say, oh, that guy looks smart. That guy looks holy. We're going to pick him and we're going to just believe whatever he says. It's not like that. They are fathers because they have demonstrated their fidelity, their faithfulness to the ancient apostolic church. They haven't deviated from what the ancient church has taught.
Right.
So that's why they're important for us.
And in doing my own research, I've learned there's been a ton of deviations. I mean, you might start in I guess you could start in 1054, but 1500s, 1800s, and so on.
Sure.
And some of those deviations have led to what I think of now as some modern interpretations of the book of Revelation. And I want to get into some of that. What obviously, just from being in modern culture, but through your research and whatnot,
right.
Some of these misconceptions must just be like nails on a chalkboard to you. But talk about some of what you hear and see and read that are common misconceptions of the book of Revelation.
Well, first of all, the primary ways that Protestants are interpreting Revelation today is very, very new. Okay. So here's what, and they should really be very careful before they listen to people whose ideas are grounded in a culture or a person's opinions that are just a couple hundred years old. Okay. Here's why. Everybody who writes a book writes it so that because they want to convey a message. And that was the same for John when he wrote Revelation. And we know he has a specific audience that he's writing to, the 7 churches of Asia. Now, did he think that they would understand this book? Of course. Otherwise, why write it? So he's using symbols that had a meaning in that culture that everybody understood. Nobody had to explain to them what the symbols mean. So I'll give you an example. Let's take something like the Nike swoosh. You see the Nike swoosh? Everybody knows that's Nike. Well, what if I said that's not Nike swoosh? That's a boomerang. That represents Australia. Would I be right just because I have this idea? Of course not. In our culture, we have symbols. We have visual symbols, but we also have words that represent ideas. So everybody knows what they mean, and you can't play with that. You can't just decide it means something else. So likewise, when John wrote, he had a specific message that he was trying to convey to those communities, and everybody knew exactly what he was saying because it was as obvious to them. When we see symbols, we know what it means. We don't have to sit and decode it. I say parking space. Oh, there's a parking space, and I run to get it, and I see this image in blue of a person with a circle. Oh, that's handicapped. I can't park there. I don't have to stop and say, gee, I wonder what that means. You know what it means. Everybody who drives here knows what it means. You see a stop sign, you know what it means. Even if it doesn't say stop, you know what it means. So my point is that John wrote this book using symbols that had a specific meaning in that culture. And if you want to know what it meant, what it means today, which it does have a modern meaning, you have to know what it meant in that culture first. So somebody cannot open it up, not honestly, not fairly, not truthfully open it up and say, oh, this is rock and roll, and this is nuclear war, and this is, transgenderism, or whatever the heck they're saying today.
Yes.
That's a misuse of the Bible. You're taking your own ideas and you're reading them into the Bible, which people do with other books too, but it's very easy with Revelation because there's so much symbolism. So the first thing that we have to remember is that we have to understand the symbols according to what they meant in those days. The second thing is that everybody who has ever interpreted Revelation in some other way, according to their own imagination, especially to create some kind of timeline for how things are going to play out, they've always been wrong.
Right.
Anybody who ever set a date for the end of the world has always been wrong because we're still here. And there have been a lot of them. This is part of the culture of the Seventh-day Adventists who set two dates during the 19th century, and they were wrong. It was a big part of Jehovah's Witnesses. They stopped setting dates, to my knowledge, because every date they ever set was wrong. So there are a lot of people who have, again, this is tremendous human arrogance. I'm going to use this thing, and this is, I guess, could be number 3 about misconceptions. Revelation is not a book that can be used to map out how the end of the world is going to happen. Make a timeline or a chart. First, this has to happen, and then this has to happen, and then this. You have all kinds of elaborate ideas about exactly what's going to happen, how the end of the world is going to play out. And this is a dangerous thing to fall into, besides being spiritually wrong, because it's just pride. It's just spiritual pride. There's a couple of reasons why this is wrong. I don't think I'm going to change anybody's opinion about this, but at least I'll say, what the problem is with this, because people are so wedded to these things. They are just so confident. So confident that they're right because they've studied it, and they've studied it, and I've studied it. The first thing that they do wrong is that they take little bits of the Bible from here and there, and they treat it like a giant puzzle where you can take a part of this and a part of this and a part of this and put it together and create a scenario. Well, actually, that is something that people used to do in antiquity too. The fathers of the church actually talk about it. Somebody like St. John Chrysostom does, and he got it from Irenaeus because he read the fathers who came before him. Chrysostom lived at the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th. Irenaeus lived in the 2nd century. And you know what he said? People who do that with the Bible, it's like they take a mosaic of the king. A mosaic is a picture made of a lot of different colored stones. And from a distance, it's a beautiful picture. They take a mosaic of the king and they rearrange it to have an image of a dog. That's what heretics do with the Bible. They just take different parts and they say, well, Paul wasn't talking about that here. He's talking about this. They take this from 2 Thessalonians, and this from 1 Thessalonians, and this from the book of Revelation, and this from Matthew, and they create their own scenario. And they're just so proud of themselves because they figured out exactly what's going to happen, how Jesus is going to return. And also believe that if they create certain circumstances, like rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, they will help Jesus come back earlier, as if Jesus needs their help. I mean, it's ridiculous if you think about it, and it's arrogant. It's spiritual delusion.
And it's scary.
It's darn scary because a lot of those people are in our government.
Yes.
And this is why they support the state of Israel. The state of Israel is not what Jesus is talking about in the Bible. Yes. In the Bible, Israel is the church. We are the new Israel of God. We are the true Israel. And this is, you see this if you understand church history, if you read the fathers of the church, if you can read early church writings, you understand that this is what they're saying. So we cannot use it as a roadmap to predict the end of the world, either the date or how it's going to play out. Now, how am I so confident in that? And why is that dangerous to believe that? I haven't even gotten to rapture. That's a whole nother thing.
Oh, that's coming. No pun intended.
Right. So why is it dangerous to do this? Because people love this. They love this. I want to remind you about somebody that, you're old enough to remember this. In the year 2011, there was a fellow named Harold Camping. Harold Camping Jr., who had a big Bible study, a big following on family radio. And he said, Jesus is coming back. May 21st, 2011. He was confident. And people were calling into his radio show, but Brother Camping, what if Jesus doesn't come back? He said, I've been doing this for 70 years, and Jesus is coming back on May 21st, 2011. Did it happen? Of course not. And not only that, not only did it not happen, but Christians, about 2 weeks before the date, this is when the mass media got word of this, and they just ridiculed all the Christians for this.
Yes,
Some people did believe him, and they maxed out their credit cards. It was a false prophet. They maxed out their credit cards. They stopped paying their mortgages. They quit their jobs because Jesus was coming back. He hurt a lot of people, but it was their fault for believing in this false prophet. They should have known better. Now, he was so confident. He was absolutely unwilling to accept that he was wrong. And even after Jesus didn't come back, about a week, he hid. He didn't come out of his house for a week. And then he said, well, I did my calculations. And Jesus came back, but he came back invisibly, as if there is such a thing in the Bible. There's no second coming of Jesus that's invisible. And the real end of the world is going to be 6 months from now, which was October 21st, 2011, and it didn't happen. So then they said, well, Brother Camping, what do you have to say for yourself? And he said, well, I guess I don't know when Jesus is coming back. Yes, we could have told you that. But notice that the arrogance and the spiritual pride to believe that you can know such a thing, when the Lord himself said, no one knows the day or the hour. It will come like a thief in the night. Who are you going to believe, Brother Camping or Jesus? And he says, oh, no, that's not what Jesus meant. That's what he meant before. And this is part of the thing with dispensationalism, where now he said nobody should belong to any church. All the churches are corrupt. Jesus wants you to know when he's coming back. Just follow me, right, Brother Camping? Or David Koresh with the Waco. I mean, there's so many false prophets that have led, well-intentioned people astray. Now, what is the danger of that, besides what some people did about quitting their jobs and things like this? The danger is this, and this is what I hope people take away from it, even if they don't buy everything I'm saying. When it comes to prophecy, the prophecy is a very mysterious thing. And we cannot know how it will be fulfilled, because it's written in a way that is a bit unclear. So I'll give you an example. One of the most famous prophecies in the Bible is Isaiah 53, right? It's about the Messiah. He will, come up or rise among us like a shoot, from dry ground. And he had no comeliness, nothing that we should desire him. He was despised. He was a man acquainted with sorrows and grief. By his stripes we are healed. All that whole chapter. Now, do you think that the Jewish leaders knew Isaiah 53 at the time of Jesus Christ?
Mm-mm.
Of course they did.
Oh, yes.
How did they not recognize when he was on trial before him that was the Messiah? How did they not recognize that? Because they had an idea in their heads. When the Messiah comes, he's going to be like this, and he's going to do this. In other words, they had created in their own minds a scenario or an idea of what the Messiah would be like. And it's not that guy, that Jesus guy. He can't be it.
Right.
So the danger in deciding that you can understand all the prophecies is this, that you will be so fixated on expecting certain developments that if the Antichrist comes, you won't recognize him as the Antichrist, because you've already decided the Antichrist has to be this. He has to fit into this mold.
Yes.
It has to be so many years, and it has to, all these other stupid details that people concoct. So there's a lot of human pride, and there's a danger because you are so convinced of your own mind, the correctness of your own mind. And God may cause the events to play out in a different way, and you could miss it. So it's better for us not to be so proud of ourselves as to think that we know exactly how the end times will play out, and instead to simply live our lives as if every day could be our end, because that's what we're supposed to be doing. And that's what all of the parables of the Lord are about. Be careful, because you don't know the hour when the master of the house is returning. So, and whether it's his return or whether it's our death, we're supposed to live every life as if we're going to, with that in mind. Now, the problem with the rapture, besides the fact that it was absolutely unknown in the early church, if it really was true, Jesus would have taught about it, okay, or some apostle would have told us about it. The rapture is a complete falsehood invented by one person.
Is it John Nelson Darby?
Years ago. Darby, couple hundred years ago, and popularized in the Schofield Bible. It was really not very well known. But Protestants love it. Now, why do they love it? Because they love the idea that because they were believers in Jesus Christ, and I'm not knocking it, in terms of anybody who's a sincere believer in Jesus Christ, I believe that you love Christ. I'm not, but why do you love the rapture? Because you think I'm going to be taken up, I'm going to be with Jesus, and there's going to be terrible suffering on earth, and too bad for all you people down there suffering in hell. But the book of Revelation does not talk about that. There is no such thing. All of the plagues in the book of Revelation have nothing to do with this sort of like period in which all the believers are going to be taken up, and then there's just going to be this punishment for sinners on the earth. That's not what the plagues are about. And nowhere in the book of Revelation, this is the most important thing, does it suggest that the believers of Jesus Christ are going to be raptured, or they're going to be spared the sufferings of the end times. On the contrary, when Jesus talks about it, when John talks about it, the whole idea is that you have to be patient and endure all of the tribulations of the end times. There's no magic taking you away from this, just, beat me up Jesus kind of thing. That's nowhere to be found in the book of Revelation. That's somebody's idea. Why would you put your trust into somebody's idea? Oh, it's this, Paul says this, and this thing, little bit, we're going to make it the image of a dog. Because they just take little snippets of the Bible, that's Bible abuse, from different parts of the Bible, and create whatever scenario they want. Well, I can tell you from the Bible that you should commit suicide. Do you know how? Judas went and hanged himself. Go and do likewise. Aren't those two different verses? Are those two verses from the Bible?
Fair.
Is this how we use the Bible? The Bible can only correctly be understood in its historical and literary context. We all know what it means to take a verse or take a statement out of context. We all understand that. That's exactly what people are doing with the Bible, because they want to force it to conform to their ideas rather than saying, Lord, you show me what it means. Okay? And I'm going to believe you, Lord, that what I'm supposed to do is pray that I not fall into the times of tribulation, but that if I do, I will be faithful to you regardless of the suffering that might come my way. That's what Jesus expects of us. He doesn't promise us. He promises persecution. He doesn't promise us rapture. That's a lot of nonsense. So I think that there's a lot of pride that people feel because they get the sense of self-satisfaction that they're going to be raptured up and they don't have to worry. But nothing in the Bible suggests that. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Again and again and again, we're told we have to be prepared to suffer for Christ.
Yes.
But we don't want to do that. We just like the idea of the raptures. So we prefer to believe that. This is very dangerous. To believe in something that just makes you feel good so you won't have to suffer for Jesus Christ. You know what? In the Orthodox Church, we want to suffer for Christ. The early Christians wanted to be martyrs. They were hoping to be martyrs. They wanted to die for Christ. They did. What does it mean that we are happy about the fact that we don't have to suffer for Christ? Because that's what the rapture is all about. Right?
Yes. And you mentioned, I want to ask you about the Schofield Bible. And I also think that I had learned this from Father John Whiteford. There was a show or a series or something called The Late Great Planet Earth.
Oh,
and then, of course,
I read that book in college.
More into my times. I remember this series called Left Behind. And I think,
don't remember the series, but I did read the book and I have it here somewhere in my office.
Between Late Great Planet Earth and Left Behind, maybe they draw from the Scofield Bible, but that's kind of where you get this idea, like, there's a plane flying and all of a sudden, whoop, and the pilot's gone or something like that.
People's imagination. And look, the reason why I always wondered, I said to myself, what is it that, excuse me for all the Protestants out there, I don't mean this to be an insult, but what is it about Protestants that they are so into the book of Revelation? And I figured it out. And it's so obvious. Because they believe they're already saved and they have nothing to do on the source except wait for Jesus to come back. And that's a very dangerous idea because it's not true. So, but if you believe you are already saved and you are guaranteed your salvation, which is also a very dangerous position to take, but I'll never convince them of it because they enjoy this idea because nothing is demanded of them. I just invite people to read the writings of the first Christians who would never have this idea that I don't have to do anything, just accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. That idea is 1,500 years old. Go back and read what people were saying about the Christian life in the first century, in the second century, in the third century, when it was dangerous to be a Christian. Nobody said, I just have to accept Jesus and I'm automatically saved. I don't have to worry about it. Nobody thought that way. That's a distortion that happened. I understand why it happened. It happened in the Reformation as a reaction against the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And I get it, but it's wrong. It's wrong because it's a reaction in the opposite direction. So the Catholic Church was saying, no, you have to do this and you have to do this. And they get the indulgences and the merit and you got to pray to the saints and Mary and all this. They had all these things. And then the Reformers said, none of that is right. So they went to the other side. They're just as wrong. We've never been following either extreme. We've always been in the middle. Orthodoxy just continued as it always has. So yeah, the late great Planet Earth, boy, that was big. That was hot. That was hot book in the 1970s. And I remember it so well because I didn't know anything. I was a brand new, theology major in college, like 20 years old or something. And I wanted to know when the end of the world is going to come. So I was reading this. Somebody said, you got to read this book. So I read it. I said, okay. I don't want to follow the Antichrist. None of us wants to follow the Antichrist. So all I have to do is look for this kind of a leader. He's going to have a mortal wound. And then I have to look for these signs. He laid it all out. And he made it so convincing. He said, when the European Common Market gets its 10th member, because there were like 8 or 9, that's before the European Union. They called it the European Common Market. So they had only 7 or 8. The 10th would be the 10 horns of the beast. When they get that, and then Red China, that's what we used to call communist China. Red China is going to go to war with the Soviet Union, and this and this and this is going to happen, and Israel's going to be attacked, and all this other nonsense. So, okay, obviously he was wrong. There's no more Soviet Union. We don't even have a European Common Market. We have the European Union. So, but you know what he does? And he's still selling books. He just kept changing it every year. So the last one I saw in a used bookstore, because I threw mine in the trash. I wish I had the original one from the 1970s. But this one from it's like the 27th printing. He just keeps changing the details. He's obviously wrong, obviously a false prophet, but he's still making money. So to quote the people who were investigating President Nixon, follow the money. Okay, he's just wealthy beyond belief. So is Tim LaHaye. People who did all the Left Behind.
Yes.
Why should they discourage that?
Right.
They're getting rich off of this, and people believe them. So this is it makes me upset because it's Bible abuse.
Yes.
It's abuse of the Holy Scriptures for people's personal gain. At least Harold Camping said, I guess I don't know when Jesus is coming back. At least he admitted he's wrong. Where are all these people to say they're wrong? Because there's no way you can be Hal Lindsey, the author of The Late Great Planet Earth, and tell me you know anything about biblical prophecy when you've been changing it year after year after year, printing a new book that people are still buying. I mean, come on. No, they don't care. They're just making money.
And how did that Scofield Bible, I understand that was the first, I believe, kind of Bible that came out where there's footnotes at the bottom and some of his...
Rapture. That's my understanding, but I've never read it.
Okay. the same kind of thing.
That's how it became popularized.
Okay. And then to talk about Andrew of Caesarea.
Yes, sir.
You write about his, I practiced this word before we started, exegetical training.
Yeah, and good for you.
Thank you.
That is exactly right.
What that means and why that's important as far as his commentary on Revelation.
Right. Okay. So what we see in Andrew of Caesarea, and this is one of the things that was so impressive. I'll just tell you a little bit about him. So this man, when it's Caesarea, there's more than one city called Caesarea in antiquity. If you recognize the word Caesarea, it sounds like Caesar. There were some rulers who wanted to basically kiss up to the Caesar. So they built a city and would call it Caesarea. There are at least 3 of them. This one was in Cappadocia, which is kind of central Turkey today. So he was the Archbishop of Caesarea Cappadocia. And he was living at the end of the 6th century. So that's like 590s to the beginning of the 7th century. That's the early 600s. And he, again, as I had told you, we don't know a lot about him, and probably because he was living through one of the most turbulent periods in human history. And this is when the Persians invaded the Eastern Roman Empire, and they destroyed virtually every city in the Middle East, including his city of Caesarea, and there's tremendous carnage and destruction, and they burnt the cities to the ground. So this is why we are missing quite a few books from antiquity, because of these wars and things like this. So how do I know that he had exegetical training? First of all, what is exegesis? Exegesis is when you look at the scriptures and you analyze them and you draw the meaning out. So like the word exodus or exit, out. You read it and you draw the meaning out. Eisegesis for in, or some people pronounce it eisegesis, E-I-S, egesis, is when you have your own ideas and you read them into the scriptures. Oh, I'm finding my ideas here. We don't want to do that.
Right.
How do we know that he had exegetical training? Because he handles this very difficult book quite expertly. It's quite amazing. And I have to tell you, one of the things that I found so striking and so different about his commentary is there were so many things. But first of all, it was extremely pastoral. It was completely grounded in the teachings and traditions of the ancient church and of the fathers who came before him. And he quoted referenced at least 18 different unknown anonymous interpretations that had been obviously passed along to him, that he knew from the early church that have not survived. He is very positive. It's like nothing you read, because most of us think about Revelation, doom and gloom and death and destruction. It's this horrific thing. And obviously it has that with the plagues, but he doesn't see it as something like God's punishing people. Instead, he talks about the plagues as God, as again and again, he speaks about God as philanthropos, which means the one who loves humankind. And that's a very common term that's used for Jesus Christ in the Orthodox Church. God is the one who loves mankind. And when he sends the plagues, it's for one purpose, and that is to help people to repent so that they can be saved. He's not just punishing them it's not like hell, in other words. It's not hell. So he talks about the plagues, but everything has a very strong pastoral tone. It's completely Christocentric. It's just, he uses the other parts of the Bible to understand the meaning. He uses other fathers who came before him and other anonymous sort of, we can say, traditions to explain things. He's also referring a lot to somebody who wrote before him in Greek, although he doesn't always agree with him. He never names him. And this is a fellow named Ikoumenios. But the other thing I like about his commentary is he's very generous. He mentions the opinions of other people, Usually he doesn't name them. And this Ecumenius fellow is one of the people he mentions. But I'll just give a word of caution to the people out there who might be reading Andrew of Caesarea. You have to read it carefully because he might report somebody's opinion and then he signals that he doesn't agree with it. So just because it's in the book doesn't mean that he agrees with it. And he'll say, some people say, I don't see how. And then he goes on to tell you what he thinks. So if you're just reading the book and you say, and he's not endorsing that opinion. So we see that, for example, in very, very early on, where it says when we have the opening vision, or actually the prologue to the book of Revelation, where it says, and this is from the revelation God gave to Jesus Christ, which he must to give to his servant John, et cetera, et cetera. The one who was, is, and is to come, and the seven spirits by his throne, and from Jesus Christ. So the one who was, is, and is to come is the Father, but not always. Later, that is used for the Son. And Andrew understands that from the context. You can see that he's doing this analysis from the context. And there are people who say the one who was, is, and is to come. The Father is the one who was, because the first thing that he says is the Father is the one who is, the Son is the one who was, and the Holy Spirit is the one who is to come. Now, he's repeating that as an opinion, but after a couple pages, you will see that he says he doesn't agree with that. And he's right. And the reason why he's right is because after it mentions the seven spirits, it says, and from Jesus Christ. So the one who was, is, and is to come is the Father alone. And the seven spirits is the Spirit, and from Jesus Christ is the Son, right? So anyhow, he's got excellent training, and you could really just see that. But if you don't understand how he's going about his analysis, it's kind of hard to explain.
Mm-hmm.
But I will tell you, one of the things that was interesting about doing this translation is you get into the mind of the person. And he would say something, and I'm like, why does he make this? Why does he draw this conclusion? And after a while, you begin to understand, you sort of see the mind at work. It's a beautiful thing. It was really interesting to have that be part of that process. Unfortunately, this book, which is a translation of the commentary, which was published by the Fathers of the Church, Catholic University of America Press.
Yes.
Fathers of the Church, volume 123, 123. They did not want a lot of footnotes. They don't like to have a lot of footnotes. I had 2,000 footnotes. So I had to take most of them out. So a lot of things that I would have said about how he was doing his analysis ended up in this book, Guiding to a Blessed End, and also the history of the book of Revelation in the Church of the East. It's called Guiding to a Blessed End because he said that the book of Revelation has great spiritual value and it can guide us to a blessed end. So that's what the title. Those are his words.
If you could transport yourself in time or him in time and sit with him right now for over some dinner, what would you ask him?
Oh, I would ask him about what I think happened.
Okay.
If I was right, because nobody had dated his commentary. And I spent a lot of time for like a couple of summers. I felt like I was living in the 7th century because I was looking for clues in his writing about what I think he lived through, what I think he experienced, because he makes little comments. He talks about, for example, he quotes from Eusebius of Caesarea when he talks about so many bodies that there weren't enough people to bury them. And then he says, and he's talking about an earlier period of time, an earlier moments in history where there was slaughter, war. And he says, we ourselves have known these things. Well, what did you experience? Were you there when they surrounded the city? And he mentions a couple of times a city being surrounded by its enemies, and he inserts that in a part of Revelation where it doesn't mention a city being surrounded by enemies. So I think that what happened is the Persians came and they surrounded the city and they occupied it for 2 years. And so a lot of this, there was like conflicting historical accounts that I had to try to make sense of, and I think I know what happened. And the question is, did he stay there and experience that carnage and that occupation, or did he leave the city? Because some bishops fled their cities and others stayed. And I think he stayed. And I think he saw a lot. And then they burnt the city as they departed. So, anyhow, I think that's what I would be interested in knowing, what he lived through. But as I said, here's the other thing that's really fascinating and shows you his maturity, his spiritual maturity, in spite of the fact that he was living during a time, Andrew of Caesarea was living at a time when most of us would say the end of the world
This is
coming.
the end of the world, right?
Yeah, because it's the end of the Eastern Roman Empire in a way, because there had not been war in Anatolia. We're talking about Asia Minor. We're talking about what is today Turkey for hundreds of years. Now, at that time, in the decades just preceding it, they had bubonic plague, and a third of the people of the nation of the empire had died. And we didn't even know that I didn't even know there was bubonic plague during late antiquity. So there was tremendous loss of life. This also meant that there was hunger because there weren't enough people to feed, to work the fields. There was climate change, believe it or not. The sea outside of Constantinople, we're talking about the Mediterranean Sea, froze in the year 602. Okay? That happened. With this, we know from historical records. You had civil war. There was unrest in the army because the emperor was not paying the army. And note to self, always pay the army. So this fellow named Phocas came and murdered the Roman emperor in Constantinople and took over. And this led to civil war, bloodshed, fighting throughout the empire. Now, this was bad enough. And then seeing that weakness, the Persians crossed the Euphrates River with 2 huge battalions and decimated the entire East. And if you think about the book of Revelation, people coming and crossing the Euphrates is a big thing. And Andrew of Caesarea has the presence of mind to say, this is not the end of the world.
Right.
I would have thought it.
Yeah.
So, but why not? And he has a very intelligent and very spiritual approach to not apply your historical circumstances to what you read in the book. Means that he is reading the book and interpreting it, not reading his own events into it. And it's very impressive. Yes. I was very impressed by him. So,
and you've led me into, I got 2 more questions for you.
Okay.
One's kind of giving the floor to you. But before we get to that, speaking of looking at what's going around and reading into our own interpretation of Revelation, I've heard since I was a kid, Mark of the Beast, here it is, Mark of the Beast, Mark of the Beast. Right. Give your thoughts, or maybe Andrew's thoughts through you on what that really represents. Yes. What should we think about that?
Yes. Well, first of all, one of the things that we should notice in the book of Revelation itself is that whenever the term, the mark of the beast, is mentioned, it's always mentioned in connection with emperor worship. Bowing down before the statue or the image of the emperor. Mark of the beast is not something you get accidentally. It means that you've chosen to worship something other than God. In that case, in the time of John, the Emperor Domitian was encouraging people to worship. He wanted to be worshipped as God. So people were asked to bow. And after Domitian, it continued. With Trajan and other emperors, it was a mark of loyalty to the emperor and the empire if you worship their statue, their image. So we should not be afraid of that. You're not going to accidentally worship something other than God. It's not a vaccine or something like that. Okay. So what is it? Well, again, here we see, we should imagine that people are going to be walking around with a 666 emblazoned on their forehead.
Right.
It means that when you have the name of something, we know that the 666 is somebody's name. It tells us that in Revelation. And when you have the name of something written like we used to write on our books in school, or even in your car, your registration, it says who the car is registered to. It has your name on it. That means that you own it. So the mark of the beast means that the evil one owns you. And it's on your forehead. It means he controls your thoughts. And it's on your right hand, because most people are right-handed, controls your deeds. That's what that means. How are we going to avoid it? By not participating in idolatry. Now, there are lots of ways to be idolatrous. And there have been, of course, the word Antichrist does not appear in the book of Revelation. We have things like the beast and the false prophet. But we could say Antichrist. John mentions it in his first epistle, uses the term Antichrist. There have been Antichrists and there will be Antichrists.
Yes.
Until the end of the world. Who it will be at the very end and how he will seek to deceive the nations, this we're not entirely sure about, although people have ideas and they speculate. The important thing is to remember who we are, what we believe, and how we're supposed to behave. And if we do the right thing, we don't have to worry about following the Antichrist. If we're not doing evil, if we're not worshiping or giving devotion to something or someone other than God.
Yes.
So I know people are kind of freaked out. I remember I mentioned as a college student, I don't want to, follow the Antichrist. How can I make sure to do that? Well, I have to see this to be like this and this and this. So what does it mean? That he will have a mortal wound that was healed, and I'll follow the beast, and they marvel at the beast. Who is like the beast and who can oppose it? How that's going to play out at the very end, I don't. But I think that the likelihood that any one of us will actually live to see those times, it's possible. But what we're called to do is to be faithful. And that's what John says in Revelation again and again and again. This is a call for the endurance of the saints. How does one become a saint? By patiently enduring the hardships. We are going to be asked to choose between Christ and evil. And increasingly, those sides are blurred because people want to make evil look attractive.
Right.
And that's what the 666 is all about. It's imitating 7. 7 is a number of perfection. So 6 is like the perfection of evil. Evil always tries to imitate the good.
Yes.
And lead people astray. So we have to remember what is truly good, what is truly honest, what is true, and not allowed to be deceived by the evil one. We know what's happening in our culture, right? Where evil things, where sin is being portrayed as something good. And if you just go along with the crowd, if you're thinking like the world, you're going to be convinced of that. But we have to be willing. And of course, the other reason why people go along with it is because they don't want to suffer for Jesus Christ. They don't want to be called haters, narrow-minded, whatever it is that people call you these days, homophobes, whatever it is, anti-Semites, anti-Palestinians,
Yes.
whatever the people want to label you, they want to shame you, they want to make you feel like there's something wrong with you.
Right.
Because you're not going along with the crowd. Well, we know that most people in the end will not be saved.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because most people are unwilling to suffer for Christ. They like Jesus Christ. They like the idea of Christ. They don't want to suffer for Christ. And so as soon as somebody says, well, you better go along with this, otherwise you're a hater and you're a this or that, or you're going to lose your job, or you're going to be ostracized. Oh, I can't stand the social ostracism. Let me go along with the crowd. Jesus talks about, it's in the Gospels, it's in Paul, it's in Revelation. We have to expect persecution. And Book of Revelation is all about encouraging us to be faithful no matter what. Be faithful unto death. Okay? If someone is to be killed by the sword he must be killed. If somebody's been taken to captivity he goes. Okay, this is in other words, what's going to happen to you is what's going to happen. But we have to remain faithful to Christ. The devil, he says, is about to put some of you into prison. But don't worry, it will not last long, just 10 days. What does that mean? First of all, look at that. Look at that. It's the devil is putting you into prison. This is very important because it shows the mind of the early church. The enemy is never the Romans. The enemy is the evil one. And that goes for us today, too. The enemy are not the people who are trying to do us harm. The enemy is the devil who's manipulating these people. So look at what he says. It's not going to last long, only 10 days. But then he implies that they're going to die after that. Don't worry about it. It's okay. But that's how it is. We have to be willing to suffer for Christ. And shouldn't we? When he suffered so much for us? Is it, this whole idea of, well, Jesus died on the cross. Thank you, Jesus, but don't ask me to suffer for Jesus. No, that we're supposed to be willing to suffer for Christ.
Well put. I was going to end this with saying the floor is yours. Speak to the book of Revelation, the apocalypse, all of these things, but you kind of just did quite beautifully, unless you have anything to add to that.
No, I mean, the point of, for our Protestant friends who don't understand why we behave the way we do, why do we have these long services? Why do we fast? Even something as simple as fasting. It's not some empty ritual. All of the things that we do are designed to give us the ability to exercise self-control, because the day may come when somebody says, do you believe in Jesus Christ? And you say, yes. Well, if you say that again, I'm going to ask you again, do you believe in Jesus Christ? And if you say yes, I'm going to slit your throat. Well, we have to be able to say, yes, go ahead, slit it. But if you aren't willing to discipline yourself or to deny yourself any material pleasure, because, even to give up a hamburger on a Friday, then how can you expect to die for Christ? And we have to be prepared to do that. It's easy for us to say in the comfort of our houses, but this is a reality for a lot of Christians in the world today.
Yes.
And the rest of us I think it's coming. It's coming in America as a kind of soft persecution. And the soft persecution is not so obvious. And this is why the devil is so successful. Because it's social ostracism. It's, it's being made to feel like there's something wrong with you because you don't accept these values that are being hoisted on us. And your children, you have to take them out of school. People having to go along with some to offer, I don't know, like we see with some of the Supreme Court cases, about the bakers who people were being targeted, or the Little Sisters of the Poor who didn't want to offer, as part of their medical plan, abortion or birth control. That's their religious value. It used to be that was sacrosanct in America, not anymore. So we have to be prepared, because our world is changing. I don't see it changing back. So I never used to think, when I was younger, that we were really close to the end, and I don't want to get people all worked up about this. But the only reason why I think that might not be the case anymore is because so many Christians have apostatized. So many Christians are willing to accept things that were absolutely unthinkable not so long ago. And so many Christians don't even know the doctrines of the church. So many Christians are willing to accept sin as normal. And so I don't think we're there yet, but we seem to be moving in that direction. So I kind of have a theory that we're going to go full circle. We're going to end up like the ancient Romans, where everything goes, because in ancient Rome, all kinds of sin was acceptable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we're moving back in that direction toward this life of hedonism that accepts virtually every kind of perversion as something that's just a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's going to happen, but it doesn't really matter, because it's always going to be the same for us. What we're called to do is remain faithful to Christ no matter what, and we have to be willing to sacrifice everything for him, just as he sacrificed everything for us. And he was sinless. We are not. So he did all of this in spite of the fact that He did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself.
Yes.
He took on the form of a servant, and being found in the likeness of men, emptied himself and became a servant and willing to die, even a death on the cross. So since he's willing to do that for us, the least we can do is be willing to suffer a little bit for him.
Well put. Amen. Now you can plug anything you'd like, website, books, any of that.
Oh, thank you for asking. I do have a website. It's drjeannie.com. You're not going to find a lot of stuff on there, although I'm going to start posting my newsletter. If you go to drjeannie.com and click on the button under it's spelled DRJEANNIE. That's how you spell Jeannie.com. There's a button under my picture and you can join my newsletter. And I send out a monthly newsletter, and it has different information. People ask me questions. Sometimes about the Bible. Sometimes it's about first century Judaism. Could be about anything. And I send that out. It's free, of course. And I'm working on a couple of books right now, but I'm not going to talk about them just yet. But I'll let you know when they get published. Let's put it that way. So my most recent one, of course, is The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. That's been very well received.
Yes.
And so I'm just that's my main. Oh, if you want to find my podcast, I do have a podcast on Ancient Faith Radio. It's hard to find sometimes, but you could find also on orthodoxbiblestudy.info. orthodoxbiblestudy.info. It has all of my podcasts. There's like 500 of them now on the Bible primarily. And
yes, and there's a section on your website of how to read the Bible, I believe, if I remember that correctly.
I just gave a little bit of an introduction. It's mostly my philosophy on reading the Bible through the eyes of the ancient church.
Yes.
Because I think that's more reliable than
certainly.
Just following somebody's opinion.
Yes.
As convinced as they are. Everybody is very sincere when they tell you what they think the Bible really means. It's not that they're lacking in sincerity, but that doesn't mean that they're right. So we base our opinions on the ancient church, and that's much more reliable.
Yes. Well said.
Thank you so much for asking.
Of course. Dr. Jeannie, I love talking with you and I love having you on. Thank you so much for being here on Counterflow.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Yes, ma'am. I hope you guys learned a lot, as did I, from that interview with Dr. Jeannie, and I appreciate her coming on. As for this show, counterflowpodcast.com, and tomorrow, this episode releases on Tuesday night. As you all know, subscribe to the YouTube page if you'd like to get the notifications for that. And I join the live chat as these debut. I hope you've been having fun in this live chat. If you are right now, tomorrow at 3 p.m. Central Time on Wednesday, I am doing a live stream from the Counterflow YouTube page with our friend of the show, John Heers, brother of Peter Heers. And we are going to talk about this new film they are putting together about what is a Christian. So if you're watching this on Tuesday night or listening on Wednesday morning, maybe today, if it's Wednesday, tomorrow, if it's Tuesday, we will be live on the Counterflow YouTube page. If you're catching this later, you can go back and watch that with our friend John Heers. I'm going to be taking a trip to Mount Athos with his brother, Father Peter Heers. More details on that soon. Just giving you all a heads up. In late August, there could be an episode or two that are missed that I won't be able to do. I'm trying to figure all of that out. As for this show, once again, next week, another good friend of the show, Charles Haywood, is back with us. We're just breaking down everything that's going on in this political arena, this craziness right now. If you have said nothing ever happens a lot, well, I suspect you know at this point you're probably wrong. So, you guys have a great one. Until next week, talk soon.
You get split in half, like on the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.